So the title for this webinar is Digital Work Transformation. We might have actually said Digital Workforce Transformation, but the more appropriate thing is Digital Work Transformation. And what I want to take you on, what we want to take you on, is a little bit of a journey. This is just going to be a sample. You're going to see, we're going to tap into some work that some of our colleagues have done here at the Center for Effective Organizations, and out there more broadly working in research and also in organizations like yours. But also, as Alexis and I and other colleagues such as Jennifer Mueller have sat down and looked at some of these questions around how do we deal with the changes that are hitting us as an organization. We're finding that there are some areas that we think need to be kind of further probed. And so no article yet on this. There is, I'll tell you about a learning opportunity at the end of the session in November we're having on optimizing the operating model. But what you're seeing here is actually fairly hot off the presses. And it's a new concept that we're playing with, and look forward to, again, hearing your feedback, but also and seeing how you can apply it as well. So first question we have, this is a fairly basic one, is how does technology impact the work design? Now, my colleague John Boudreau and Robin Jessup-Faison have written a couple books together, and the most recent one was called Reinventing Jobs. And they do a really great job of going through and looking at the specific question around how is it that automation impacts the work? And they kind of nicely titled the book Reinventing Jobs. And what they recommend is that when you think about technology coming in and automating what takes place in the job or in the business process, that you want to think about kind of breaking the work down into what are the different parts that can be automated versus the ones that can't. You want to think in terms of optimizing that work around which parts should be automated, actually go through the automation process, and then, as they say, to reconfigure it. One of the most kind of straightforward examples of this is if you think about an assembly line. The way things were done way back in the beginning was almost all entirely manual labor. It's a little bit of a tease to show people sitting at separate workstations on the left. Obviously, they're producing something different than the people on the right. But for to a large extent, if you think about what the original manufacturing line looked like, the Model T coming off the Henry Ford assembly line, it was almost all people doing the assembly work there. And then over time, those things have been automated. To now on the right, you've got it's the ratio of, say, people to machines has gone a lot more in favor of machines, even to the point now where we're finding in some cases you could have fully automated assembly lines. So this is a story that we all know, right? So this is one that's being told over and over again. What we want to do is to raise a couple of ways of thinking about technology that is going to perhaps get you to help reframe a bit of how you think about it. So first one is that when we think about technology, it can be used to constrain us, or it can be used to really enhance what we're doing. John and Robin in their book talked about how there are threats to people's skills, and essentially their tasks being taken away. So your job can be totally automated out of existence, and you have to go find something else to do. And that's always a challenge for people who are working in kind of more manual task-oriented roles where it's easy for machines to be able to come in and take their jobs. And in other cases, technology transforms what we do, but can actually make us more productive. So a little bit more, enhancing. There's two different ways to talk about this. We can talk about technology being a control mechanism, or technology being a learning mechanism. So in particular, around the control mechanism, anytime we use technology to improve efficiency of business processes, we are saying that we're going to take the variance in performance that is introduced by people, and we're going to narrow that variance performance down by introducing these control systems. So accounting systems are one example of this. Human capital management systems can be like this, call centers. But then on the other hand, technology can also be a learning mechanism. So now Alexis and I haven't rehearsed this ahead of time, but we've worked with it for many years. So I'm going to pass the ball over to her because, in fact, this idea about technology being a learning mechanism is something that she was one of the first people to point out to me. So Want to go for it, Alexis?
Well, I can a little bit, although I don't want to steal all of your thunder. One of the things that's really fascinating about this is, as Alec points out, it really is an opportunity to fundamentally change and evolve the way the organization, in these examples, meets customer needs or really reconfigures the work. In other words, rather than technology being something that is specifically limited to a business process, it can really move into the design phase in terms of a physical asset. It can turn into the design phase in terms of how we address meeting market needs, not simply internally speeding up a production line, to look at the slide from a moment ago. And beyond that, the area where I personally work is technology can really help us know things that were previously unknowable in a way that lets us help organizations get better. So you'll see a couple of the examples at the bottom of the slide, things like organization network analysis and natural language processing. You can begin to detect systems in organizations, patterns of learning and connection and information flow, particularly among knowledge worker type organizations, that were simply undetectable in the past. And that allows technology to really help us improve the way that we manage and engage with our organizations. If you want to delve deeply into organization network analysis, there are certainly people doing work in this area, the same way with natural language processing, but the ability to detect signals that were simply invisible and impenetrable, and then use those to better detect or to better assign high potentials into organizational nodes will be really, really important, or to find those individuals, the opportunity to find really subtle and distinct patterns that would wash out in a large aggregate analysis, but that can become very, very crisp and bright using newer technological methods. Those let us continue to drive organization effectiveness in ways that simply were not possible 20 years ago when I was being trained.
Yeah,
Is any of that useful, Alec?
Oh, of course it is. You shouldn't have to ask, Alexis. And by the way, if anybody wants to propose a question, you can do so through the Q&A feature. But please be sure to select everyone so we'll see it. You can also try the chat as well. But just regardless, choose just send a message to everyone so we can see it. What I also want to kind of throw in here, I mean, we could spend a long time talking, just about this different kinds of technology that are out there. But kind of one more side note, and then we can move forward. This thing about big data has been it's been around for quite a while now. I mean, it's been at least, I don't know, maybe 8 years or so since I wrote a bit of a critique around, kind of what does big data really mean if we're talking about coming internally within organizations and looking at the people side of things. I think that there's a little bit of a misconception around kind of, we've got enormous new things that we're learning about consumer behavior and about how people are interacting with their phones and with the internet and location-based services. I mean, for those things, we're literally in the world often now. In fact, we can throw in there the Internet of Things, which is going to be multiplying these things by many orders of magnitude, where there's just going to be there's incredible volumes of data that are coming in that at a certain point we need to throw a bunch of this data into computer systems and have it see where there's patterns and pattern recognition. But one of the reasons why big data is not listed on this slide is, well, there's two reasons. One is that it's become a little bit too much of a catch-all for kind of anything that's new and interesting that we're measuring, and it's too diffuse that way. I mean, it's not good enough to really make sense of. But also, having a computer go and look for patterns in data is literally data mining. And it doesn't matter if you're a marketer, if you're a product designer, or if you're managing people internally. There's a lot of deep knowledge that we know about kind of about consumer behavior, about employee behavior, about how we have to structure systems within organizations to be effective. And any kind of a simple, pattern recognition approach, which is what big data is, only can tell you things. It might be able to tell you patterns you haven't seen before, but to make sense of them, we have to come back to what we know about what makes people and employees and organizations tick. And that's actually where that's kind of a key takeaway for the session today is around we don't do enough of thinking about how the actual structure of the work needs to change. So John and Robin talked about how jobs need to change, but there is this much bigger picture about how those jobs are embedded within the end-to-end business processes. And so when technology changes, there can be really big or there can be more kind of evolutionary impacts in terms of the work itself. So along those lines, there is a big distinction also between what we're going to call work reconfiguration versus technology transformation. So the story about work reconfiguration only goes back about a century or so, if not longer. And what we're going to say right now is not going to surprise anybody, but you might not always think about this when you think about technology change. So and let's call this process optimization. So process optimization happens all the time without there being any change in the products and services produced by the enterprise. Okay. Classic example of this is the work that took place back in the 50s and 50s and 60s, where Edward Deming was looking at the challenges around getting things like automobile manufacturing lines to have higher quality, to have greater efficiency, and to be meeting more objectives than just fast throughput, and creating these large complex things they're putting together like automobiles. That work process optimization led to things like self-managing work teams. Really important innovation and something that I'd say that today we're still learning the lessons of. I mean, in many ways, if you look around, you can look at call centers, you can look at a lot of knowledge-based work, and the principles around self-managing teams are everywhere, but at the same time, they're also often not applied extremely well. And so in some ways, we're kind of constantly relearning some of the things that Deming tried to teach us over 70 years ago at this point. And this is happening all the time in our organization. Now, one thing to point out is that anytime you reconfigure the work, you increase uncertainty. And you have to essentially relearn what it means to be working under that new system. So if this is sounding like some of the things we have to deal with in terms of technology change, that's true as well. Because anytime technology comes in and changes how we could do the work, whether it's through automation or through learning, then we're learning new ways to do the work. Because even if we're making things more efficient, we have to figure out how we break the work out between what work is done by people versus what's done by machines. I mean, there is no process within an organization that is ever fully automated. Right? I mean, people have to take control at some point. And so part of what we lose sight of is when we talk about things like automation, there's a work redesign and work reconfiguration that in many ways is more complicated and difficult to solve than the question about what parts you automate. You have to learn how to make things work in that system. So ideally what you would do is you would kind of do the process optimization and the automation separately from each other. You're not always given that luxury, but conceptually, you'd be much better off if you tried to do it that way. Any comments or kind of additional thoughts at this point, Alexis?
No, I just really love the fact that we're talking about this, because this idea of reconfiguring the work and how we can use automation and process optimization to really not only make faster those things we were already doing, but the reconfiguration of that, particularly getting rid of legacy things that might have made sense on an earlier technology, with an earlier legal framework, with an earlier customer framework, those things that kind of calcify that nobody knows why we're doing them anymore. We have tremendous opportunities to combine what we know about process optimization, what we can do in terms of automation, to sense some of those opportunities, and ultimately to make work not only more efficient, but truthfully a lot less miserable. So that matters from a human perspective as well. Safer, more secure, reduce bias. There's all kinds of wonderful things that we can be doing by examining the entirety of the way work gets executed, as opposed to just automating those things that we're doing now. Straight machine learning tends to sometimes just automate those things we're doing now, sometimes quite senselessly.
Yeah, well, and in fact, I mean, and I know you've seen this where, in the companies you've worked with, and we have, my colleagues and I here at the center have, is there's oftentimes we kind of dive headlong into automation and bringing a new technology in. We think about kind of what's the shortest path to introducing the new system, and if in rare circumstances, people will think through carefully the change management part of it, and they'll think about, well, who do we have to get involved? We probably have to staff up additional extra consultants and people, and externally and internally, so that we can get through this change. But I've yet to see the case where I think they really think through really carefully what are all the implications in terms of how you have to work with these new technologies and work with these new systems in terms of how it means changing the work. And inevitably, this is why anytime we say, rolling out a new technology system or, new way of doing the work, that we plan on taking, 6, 12, maybe 18 months, and inevitably it takes 2 or 3 times as long to really get it right.
Well, and I think that part of the piece there is people are thinking very rationally about the work instead of remembering some of the very, very first lessons that sort of modern management science learned about reconfiguring work in terms of socio-technical systems and how you disrupt not only the business process of work, but the way people work together, and what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Alrighty. So here's a kind of classic example. So in the Deming way of looking at things, for those of you who maybe don't know all the details, the way to think about it is that in traditional hierarchical organizations, which is kind of the classic way with the military and the way that most manufacturing lines are set up, you had the hierarchical structure on the left where everybody reports into a manager, and pretty much all decision-making takes place at the manager level. On the right, we have a kind of a more high involvement approach, as our colleague Ed Lawler talks about it, high involvement work practices. And in that case, you try to push as much decision-making down amongst the members without having to have them push things back up into their immediate supervisor or somebody above them. This principle around how much do we design for hierarchical management versus more involved kind of decision-making further down is probably the most foundational question that all organizations face, and where a lot of the kind of challenges are in terms of being able to improve your strategy execution, get to better efficiency and effectiveness. Precisely because there's no one answer that fits across the entire organization. Depends on what part of the business, depends on choices you make. You can actually make conscious choices between how much you're going to do a hierarchical approach versus more self-managing. And there's all kinds of things you have to build around in terms of capabilities, performance management, communication, and the like. And so it's that optimization of the work is critically important and risky. We have a question here from Brett. How do you suggest navigating the chicken versus egg challenge of process optimization and automation? What do you do first, and how do you evolve best? Do you optimize a process and then see how automation can solve a process problem? You're studying automation technology to see how to optimize the process. So, Brett, I'd say the answer is yes. This is I love how you solve it. It's the chicken and egg problem. There is optimization that's taking place all the time. Now, in fact, part of the problem, and Alexis and I have talked a lot about this over the years, is that a lot of times optimization will be taking place in a vacuum, or it'll be taking place in one part of the organization without thinking about the full end-to-end business process questions that you have to be addressing to really get that optimization right. So there's always a need to be kind of focusing on where optimization is happening right now. At the same time, there are discrete points at which technology comes in, right? So you have to upgrade your enterprise resource, your ERP system, and maybe you're moving to a new platform, or you're upgrading from one to the next. And there's a lot of things that the organization's been sitting there waiting to happen that will then get piled on to that, to kind of bringing in that new platform or adopting a new technology into the organization. So there needs to be a much more holistic approach, and recognizing that you have to be thinking about the process optimization both when you're making the decisions about what technology to bring in, then as you're going through the implementation phase, and even for kind of months and years beyond that, once people have considered the new technology system up and running, there's going to be ongoing process optimization that goes along with it. Any comments to add there, Alexis, or should we move on?
I think we should move on. We're 20 minutes in. We've got a lot left to cover.
Well, we do and we don't.
Well, okay, that's fair. Yep.
Yes, not that many slides, and yes, definitely people feel free to give other questions if you have them. That was a great one. So now let's switch over to actual technological transformation of products and services. Now, question for you. What is a bigger disruption from a customer standpoint? Okay, this is where I wish we had all open lines, but it would be a disaster if we unmuted everybody. So I'll pretend to be the to give both the answers and the questions at the same time. Okay, so if we think in terms of things disrupting it from a customer's perspective, so here we have the transition from, well, first of all, kind of the step before the one on the left is before the Walkman came around, we had all the traditional ways we played music, right? So then Sony introduced miniaturization, and the first the big innovation here was you could essentially carry your music around in your pocket with you, and it was literally done on cassette tapes that you had to make yourself. They then had MP3 players where you could be kind of taking the music that was on your computer and loading it onto your MP3 player. But it was only when Apple finally came out with the iPhone and iTunes that then we truly were in a musical digital age. Okay? So at each stage here, there were some fairly cool things that happened and ways for us to be able to kind of carry our music with us that depending on who you are could be fairly disruptive. Contrast that with the idea of having a pacemaker inside your body, where for the longest time, for decades and decades, it sat in there and it just helped keep you alive. I mean, that's no small task, and I don't know that I want my pacemaker to do anything more than keeping me alive. But now in today's internet-connected era, in fact, it's the case now. If you read this Atlantic article, the author makes it sound like people don't even have a choice anymore. Right? So you go into a hospital operating room, you just had a heart attack, they put a pacemaker in. Of course, you're going to say yes. They don't even necessarily say, oh, guess what? You're now going to have this data that's being sent from outside your body, from your body to these outside groups. It's both the pacemaker manufacturer and then also, the healthcare system. Oh, and by the way, you don't even necessarily own the data. Or if you own it, you might have a hard time getting access to it. So in many ways, that feels incredibly disruptive, and it is. And it's much more invasive than taking your music from having to listen to it at home to being able to carry it with you to then, having it in your pocket. So from a customer's perspective, there's ways of thinking about how much disruption is going on here. And to be honest, when people talk about technological transformation, they pretty much talk about this side of it, right? They talk about how does it look from the customer's perspective, because the more disruptive a technology is on the customer space, the greater the market opportunities. Right? The greater the chances to be able to actually sell more things to people, and that's what really drives business decisions and strategy making. So I do not want to diminish in any way whatsoever the importance of thinking about customer disruption. But what I want to argue is that we think way too much about that. And we don't think about how those technology changes in the products and services actually disrupt the work design. So for the rest of the time, we want to talk about two different ways of thinking about the work design. And one's going to be an evolutionary change in the work design versus a revolutionary change in the work design. But this is in how the work is done within the organization, not how the product or service is kind of received by the customer. So, example number one, coming back to the music industry. So Alexis and I were actually talking before this call about the change in what happened in music. I've done a lot of talking to this point, Alexis. Do you want to kind of take people on the journey of what it meant to be going from the Walkman in particular to what did it mean when music got digitized as we went into as we went from things being done analog to things being done digitally?
Well, I can talk a little bit, and what's fascinating about this example is that it operates on almost every level. It operates on the level of pure technology. What are we doing from the process of what's required to miniaturize, what's required to digitize, what's required to put something now from downloaded in the cloud, what's the infrastructure required. As a set of engineering problems, these are fascinating, and that's quite clear. One of the things that if you follow innovation, people talk about quite a lot is also the business model and how do we make money off of music. So rather than going from record contracts, you're going on sales. Now, essentially, the entire industry has flipped. The record companies are having all kinds of challenges, and musicians now end up making their money off of concerts. So the entire the model has, in fact, in some ways, come full circle. Before recorded music, of course, that's how musicians had to make money as well. It entirely changed the process of discovery of music. Wildly opened the aperture of what was discoverable and findable. It opened up new opportunities both for individuals, so listeners to discover new music. It opened up new channels and opportunities for creators of music to find new audiences. And it opened up new opportunities for, in effect, distributors to use technology such as if you subscribe to any music service, and I won't name any so that I don't accidentally promote them, but certainly most of your digital services will have some kind of a feature of, suggested for you based on your past listening that aggregates the results of, millions and hundreds of millions of listeners or users to look at patterns of consumption and find areas where you are different from that pattern of consumption, might want to add something. So one of the things that's really fascinating is the number of levels on which this transformation, specifically this example of music, really makes sense. It was technologically, as an engineering feat, it was really different. From a business model, monetization, who makes money, from an experience of the producers of music, moving from a recording-focused experience to a live performance-focused experience, from the listeners and the way that they engaged, and then the folks who are making money off of it. It really operated at almost every level. And so when we think about work design, you have to think about all of those people doing work within the system. The engineers clearly are functioning differently. They have different skills and are engaging together differently. Your product marketing folks are engaging really differently. The people working in the music business themselves are now doing less sales directly to Tower Records and less top 100 lists and much more about promotion. And if you've been to shows, if that's a thing that you do, you'll notice they've moved much more into merchandise and things like this, using different monetization channels, which fundamentally requires new skills. It fundamentally requires different people to pay attention to each other. It requires different data inputs and different data outputs. So those of us who study work have almost every piece in that system. The creators of the music, the managers of the music, the engineers creating the technology by which the music is delivered, the listeners who have a role in consuming and discovery, all of those elements have fundamentally changed in ways that impact who you talk to, what skills you need. Is that helpful?
Absolutely, yeah. And then, so having cast kind of a really broad net and talked about kind of the whole landscape of the music industry, if we kind of narrow back into kind of the actual music companies, right? So you think about, the traditional music companies, the ones that before iTunes and music became truly digitized, their go-to-market, their whole way that their business model was set up was all about physical. So they would make the contracts with the artists. They oftentimes were kind of the kings and queens of the industry because they got to decide. They would often have the direct relationships with the channels, so that the radio stations in particular. And so it was almost, there was competition there, yes. But speaking as an economist, my background is in economics, it was much less of kind of a full, free market competition and more like, a bunch of, dominant players where they compete with each other in terms of cost, but there's a limited number of people who are actually controlling the vast majority of, kind of decision making, how things happen in the industry. And their economic model was built on distributing things in physical format to people who bought the physical format and then used it at home, right? So the physical format originally was albums, LPs. Then it became tapes. That was a big innovation. And then CDs was also a big innovation. Now, these were innovations because from the user's perspective, things got more and more convenient. As we went from records to tape, all of a sudden now we could carry something around with us. We could play music in the car. When it then became CDs, we're now able, things are a lot more compact, and they're not getting damaged. So CDs wouldn't get damaged the same way that records would. It also was a great moneymaker for the music companies because they got to be able to resell you music that you already owned.
Of every format. That's right.
Exactly. My daughter, who's 19 years old now, will look back at me and say, "So what happened to those hundreds of albums that you used to own, Dad?" And I say, "I converted them all over to CDs. And had I known the LP was going to come back, I probably would have, stuck them in a closet somewhere."
Yep.
Would have been worth a fortune now, but of course we can all say that in retrospect about the things that we didn't save. But from the record company's perspective, I mean, it was a big deal to figure out technologically how to work with tape as opposed to records. But tape itself existed. I mean, that technology existed and was used in computers and lots of other formats. So figuring out how to put kind of audio files there was other kind of digital. There wasn't a lot to be solved on the engineering side. And then similarly, when CDs came out, I mean, it was a new kind of thing that had to be manufactured, different kind of chemical processes and doing a CD versus an album versus a tape, but it was the same business model. Right? Same business model of you've got the upstream, you've got all the artists and they're creating their records. You're getting the deals with them, signing the big contracts, and everything goes through to the big recorded music industry players. But when the music itself was actually digitized. Oh, and by the way, the first digital revolution in music happened when the tapes that were being that all the stuff was being recorded on, that was analog. And CDs, for those of you old enough to remember, it was a big deal because all of a sudden now we were digitizing what was previously analog, and that initial conversion wasn't that great. So people would actually argue, if you're a real kind of audiophile, people would argue that, well, CDs are not as not as high quality. You're actually ruining, you're losing lots of information that should be there. But the industry survived that. So that was the first digitalization within that industry. But the one that really upended it was when all of a sudden now you didn't have to have things in a physical format. So we had MP3 files, but we didn't have iTunes. And when Apple came out with iTunes, and a business model for people paying for digital music, that was when everything fell apart. And the recorded music industry has never been the same since. So the transformation of the work was very different depending on, first of all, what part of the industry you sat in and what particular technological change there was that was taking place. Now, contrast that to what's happened with implanted medical devices. So it is absolutely creepy to think that things like pacemakers or other implantable devices now can be monitoring us in ways that we don't want them to. Truly creepy. But the reality is, from the perspective of the device manufacturer, obviously there's lots of things you have to get right here. Right? I mean, it's a big deal to now be transmitting information outside of somebody's body, and to do that safely, in terms of not hurting them, in terms of having the device still do everything it's supposed to do. Those are big issues, right? So you still have to do a lot to be able to incorporate that new technology into the pacemaker, but the fundamental nature of a pacemaker doesn't necessarily change when you do that. Right? There's all kinds of horror stories where, if you look up, in fact, this article talks about, Dick Cheney, who was the vice president of the United States, had the internet connected features of his pacemaker disabled so he couldn't be assassinated. Right? So there's big issues about things like internet security that a medical device manufacturer never needed to think about before. I mean, they think about it in terms of the files sitting on their corporate servers. so somebody couldn't steal their trade secrets. But they never had to think about internet security for the devices they're putting into people's bodies, and now they do. So that's a capability that has to be built, and it's an important one. But arguably, it's an evolutionary change in the work design, not a revolutionary change in the work design. And to make that point, we'll have this slide here. Okay, so this is kind of the punchline of the session, and we'll spend a bit of time on this, and definitely please feel free to put your questions forward. But what we want to propose is that when we think about the work design itself, there can be really big disruptive changes in how you have to think about the whole end-to-end processes within the business. But then there are others that are more evolutionary. So when the recorded music industry had to figure out how to go and do CDs, that was an evolutionary change. You still were operating manufacturing plants. You still were selling physical product that had to go to distribution channels. You had to, figure out how to get people to want to buy these things, and then also work with the electronics manufacturing industry, because they, of course, were creating these new players called CD players. So important changes, and they had to do a lot of work to deal with them. But if you think about this from the perspective of like Clayton Christensen and disruptive innovation, coming out with CDs was not a disruptive innovation for the manufacturing industry. The disruption happened when the distribution channels went digital, which interestingly, from those of us on the consumer side, probably wasn't that big a deal. I mean, it's kind of cool to now have music on your phone, but you could do that before. I mean, it was a lot more work, where you had to essentially take your CDs, burn them onto your computer. You could then transfer the files to an MP3 player, or maybe pull them off the internet from Napster. But it took a lot of work. Whereas when Steve Jobs and Apple figured out this new ecosystem around iTunes and actually digital distribution, that's when the recorded music industry's business model went under. I'm going to pause. Alexis, any thoughts you want to add here?
Really just that we've been talking about revolutionary versus evolutionary change in sort of the innovation and change management world for decades. But it really is useful here when we think about it from a work design standpoint, and the importance of distinguishing between the technological change and then the work design or work capacity change. And not, as Alec points out, not every engineering change is particularly revolutionary or even impactful on a lot of the work design. Whereas occasionally the work design can change dramatically on the back of an unchanging business model or an unchanging technological model. So making sure to address the fact that these things can move independently. Of course, it's best if they can move together. In general, you get the biggest impact. But the fact that each of them needs to be considered individually, I think, is really important, and it seems to be often missed.
Yep, absolutely. So getting back now, so the question then becomes, what do these things look like when we're talking about changing the work design? And this, so if we get back to the original conversation we were having around kind of who takes responsibility for kind of thinking about these technologies and doing process optimization, if you look kind of at the bottom bullet in each of these sections here. So under the evolutionary change in the work design, what that means in terms of designing the work is that if you think about the entire organization design, there's going to be certain parts of it that need to be kind of redesigned, but what you're largely doing is you're keeping the existing organization design the same. So in that recorded music industry, the people who are dealing with the contracts for the musicians, their jobs pretty much stayed the same. There is now going to be new agreements that have to work in place that finance has to get involved with figuring out, kind of what are the margins going to look like as we're now doing, now doing CDs as opposed to doing just tapes and records. And the artists are going to worry about their royalties and how much is being charged. So there's a lot of kind of new ground that has to be plowed when this new technology comes out of distributing on CDs. But but for the most part, the different parts of the organization are staying the same. Right? You're going to have new manufacturing capability, but you already have a manufacturing organization that has been doing this for decades. So the existing organization design largely doesn't change. Kind of if you think about the big picture of it. Under revolutionary change, you have to think about redesigning the entire business process from end to end around the new capabilities. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to all of a sudden be losing entire parts of the business. I mean, the recorded music industry, even after iTunes came out and we were, dealing with a lot of things being done digitally, you still have CDs. You still have, LPs, which it turns out that they're now making a comeback. But if you think about how much resources are dedicated towards that manufacturing capability, what is the driver of kind of incremental value for the shareholder? Those parts of the organization today in the recorded music industry account for so much of a smaller amount of profitability than they used to. Right? As Alexis said, I mean, now we're kind of gone full circle to the point where these days artists don't even think so much about how much money they're going to make from royalties. If you're good enough, if you're a kind of somebody who can have a big hit, you're not thinking so much anymore about what you can make on royalties. It's about going back on the road and making money from concerts. There still is a lot of money being made by music going out there, but the margins were decimated by having when the distribution channel went digital, and so that's then caused people to have to entirely rethink what does value creation look like with the music industry. Now, coming to implanted medical devices, it's an engineering challenge to be able to put internet connectivity into a pacemaker. It's a big deal, right, to do it right. But the people who are really good at doing kind of the mechanical engineering and the other kind of chemical engineering that's needed to be able to make these implanted medical devices work, you might have to bring in some new engineering capabilities, right? Software engineering that you didn't have before, but the amount of the product that has to change. If you think about the pacemaker, it's a relatively small amount of the features of the product itself in terms of what is it, all the different parts that are going in there, different functionality. And what you're left with is, for the most part, the same product being produced within the same organization. We're adding some additional features to it. So it's only an evolutionary change in network design. Now, when we think about kind of internet connectivity impacting lots of different things, so take a look forward at the Internet of Things, where more and more things are being internet connected. There's probably going to be a range of different ways in which the work design gets impacted. And in some ways, we're not going to know. I mean, there's entirely new business models that haven't been created yet around information processing for things that are going to be internet connected, where it's probably going to take 5 or 10 years from now until we'll know what those look like. And they may end up being highly disruptive, or they may not. To start with, they're going to the kinds of work design changes you're going to see in organizations as the Internet of Things comes out. We're talking about refrigerators, if we're talking about having wearables and clothing, different kinds of impacts. So let's just take those two examples. So making a refrigerator internet connected, much like a pacemaker, it's going to be a relatively small amount of the total product design. And also we make refrigerators to go sit in people's kitchens for 10, 20 years, hopefully. And the technology is going to evolve. So they need to think a bit about, well, how can we create a way to be able to be kind of keeping that system going and updated in the same way that, like Tesla right now with their electric cars, they can send software updates over the air. That's a really cool thing to do. The question then, though, is, what do we do for that technology sitting inside a refrigerator, right? How do we think about it so that we can make it upgradable over time? And what are the implications then for the work design for that, for the refrigerator manufacturer? So a lot of interesting things that are going on out there. Before I go on to the next slide, again, just to remind people, if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat or the Q&A. Let's move to next. So, and this is kind of the last, slide I want to use to kind of set the framing here. This is I'm calling this analysis matrix, probably can have a better name for it. But if you think about kind of the different levels at which work takes place, we can break it down to 3 different pieces. So if you look across the top, on the right, we've got the individual, that's individual jobs. We then have teams, and then we have business units or business processes. This idea about kind of thinking about the operating model and about how technology is going to be transforming work. And transforming the end-to-end business processes, there is work that is created and takes place and has to get managed at each of these different levels, at the individual job level, at the team level, at the business unit, business process level. I'm not going to go through all the different, cell, the words inside each of these different cells here, but what you can see if you read through them, on the left there's work design questions we have to address. There's issues around how we staff those roles and how we do talent management with them. There's the actual work itself. So a lot of times when we think about kind of how we deal with technology changing, deal with optimizing processes in the organization, we think about things like defining new roles and responsibilities, giving people training and kind of closing capability gaps so they can do the new work. But a lot of times it falls through the cracks is how do we actually manage the work? This is something that Alexis and I have talked quite a bit about. You want to kind of throw in your 2 cents here, Alexis? I mean, we could literally spend probably like an hour or 2 hours talking about this slide. Yeah, so go ahead.
Well, that's a good point about it. I'm looking, and we only have 10 minutes left. But one of the things that's fascinating, if you think through any kind of system thinking challenge, even just change management, it becomes really important to make sure that you're addressing all of the various pieces of a system. So if we're looking at work design, what does this mean from a business unit standpoint? What does this mean that happens within the context of that team, either structurally or operationally? And then what individual capabilities, skills, information, et cetera, might an individual need? All of those things for optimal performance really need to be aligned. It's very old-fashioned, think of it like a Swiss watch, but things absolutely have to, those old school gears absolutely have to be able to line up, or everything sort of grinds, is inefficient, is error-prone and fragile. So from a work design standpoint, from a talent management standpoint, from an intake into the organization and execution within that, the work execution itself, and even what the ultimate financial performance of that organization is, all of those things really should be addressed as a whole. And my personal experience, as well as just sort of philosophical alignment to this model, is you can do, in some cases, more harm than good by focusing only on one cell. You can really get folks excited about one piece where they're then constrained by the rest of the system, and take something that you've now poured a lot of energy into, and it doesn't actually make anything better. It just creates distress and grit into a system. So we really appreciate the opportunity to kind of look through all the different elements that are moving here.
And if we get back to kind of Brett's question that he posed before about, what's the chicken and egg of process optimization, automation, I mean, I use a diagnostic like this to be able to help us figure out. I mean, so when we talk about so first of all, process optimization, well, what is it we're trying to optimize, and where are the opportunities? Because sometimes we're optimizing what's happening in one role, like a sales role or or manufacturing role. Okay? Sometimes we're doing that at the team level. Right? That was the whole idea behind self-managed work team. In other cases, it's about end-to-end business processes. So if you think about what the kind of business process reengineering did, they were kind of finding ways to get people to think about how do you get from order to cash, right? From when an order comes into the system, follow it through from one handoff to the next to figure out where you've got gaps in the business processes so you can actually get to better performance end-to-end. That's optimization. But then things like automation is only going to happen once you've got certainty around how the work should be done. And there's different degrees of certainty versus uncertainty in terms of what people's jobs are and the tasks they have to do, what has to happen at the team level, and then what has to happen at the business process level. So this idea about kind of when do you do process optimization, when do you do automation, they really go hand in hand. And because they're so interdependent on each other, we need to be thinking about these different elements here. I mean, the one thing I will say is that, that next to last line from the bottom, the work execution and management, I find it fascinating how we separate these things out so much. I mean, we talk about things like performance management, but what people oftentimes go to is the performance management system, which is like the last thing you want to think about, because by the time we're giving people performance ratings, by the time we're talking about what kinds of promotions they should have, kind of differentiating what rewards people are going to get, a 3.1% raise or a 2.6% raise. By that point, the entire herd of horses has already left the barn. I mean, performance has happened. We're backward looking. We're not really doing anything to affect future performance, and that's why a lot of what I've loved about as an economist coming in and learning from my great colleagues like Alexis and others who work in the field of organization behavior is this idea that you need to be looking forward all the time. So things like goal setting goal setting is one of the most important things we can do, and we tend to do a really bad job of it, right? Either we're setting stretch goals that are so hard that it breaks people, or we're worried, we're trying to meet our performance objectives, so we set them so low so we can get our bonus, that we actually don't challenge people enough. And it's a hard knife edge to kind of get, to get goal setting right. I mean, true accountability, that's a really hard one, right? I mean, people talk about holding people accountable, but oftentimes that comes to pointing fingers and not so much figuring out how to actually get better accountability in the system, and without there being, lots of shaming and blaming. And these conversations about how you manage performance are almost never part of the conversation around how do you do process optimization automation. But those things require that the rest of the system be working really well together. And so if you don't have good transparency around what you're trying to accomplish, then you can't hold people accountable, right? I mean, if you don't actually know what people are doing, and people, and people actually, agree that, we're not just going to focus on what you can verify objectively, which is the biggest part of all performance management systems, but there's also stuff that we know, right? We all know that Sally, she does a really good job of hitting her numbers, but she burns through people, or she cuts corners, and, but rather than focus on, how do we hold her legally accountable or worry about getting Sally fired if she steps over the line, the challenge is what do we do to actually think about, what do people know about how she's acting as a leader? What is it that we can actually bring to the table to bear in terms of both hard power and soft power? And anything we want to do in terms of process optimization, kind of taking more discretion out of the system, bringing automation so technology is then making the decisions for us, that has profound implications on what Sally has been doing as a leader, what she has to be doing, what kinds of information she has to be managing, and also her capabilities as a leader, as well as the capabilities of the people on her team. And so, for Alexis and me and our colleagues who do this kind of work, it's not an either or, it's that you need to be thinking about all these things at the same time, and why we oftentimes do come back and talking about the system. In closing, want to just throw this up there. In a little under 2 months' time, I'm going to be leading a workshop called Optimizing the Operating Model. It's going to be November 5th to the 7th in Boston. I've got 3 great guest speakers who all are really incredible leaders within the HR space, but they actually are, I think of them as true business leaders as well, because they're able to really think deeply about these questions around the organizational operating model and both the business operating model, but the talent operating model and the financial operating model. A couple of examples we're going to dive into is one that we've just started to scratch the surface on today, which is around digital disruption, and the other is around organizational capabilities. And there's a link there for an article I just wrote to think about kind of the human capital operating model. What I would say is that would love to have you join us there. If you are interested in a bit more around the specific question around kind of technology and HR, the future of HR, we have another program that's going to happen just the week before in Los Angeles called the Future of HR program. And if you go to our website, you can see it there. In closing, very happy to have you engage with us. Didn't really give a big spiel at the beginning about the Center for Effective Organizations, but let me just say in closing, we've been around for 40 years. We do all of our work partnering directly with companies like yours to be able to come together to solve business challenges. Alexis and I paths crossed when she was in a previous role, and they were looking at a simple question around workforce planning. I say tongue-in-cheek. It actually was a deep question about workforce planning that actually fundamentally got to the organization's ability to execute its entire strategy. And as we went to peel away the layers of the onion around, well, what does it really mean to be, kind of building workforce capability and thinking about what the business needs are, we quickly found it was a much more complex question than even most, I'd say cutting edge strategic workforce planning approaches would take. These are the kinds of questions that we love engaging with, people like you on this call. And so, please come join us at a future event, and we're also happy to talk to you about partnering as well. And thank you, Alexis, for your time today. I really appreciated you sharing your thoughts with us.
This is always fun. I always love the opportunity to talk about ideas like this.
Wonderful. Anything in closing, Gina?
No, I think you covered it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
And as you said, we will make available the recording and slides afterwards.
Yep.
Perfect.
All right, thanks, everybody. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thanks.